Hello everyone, thanks for coming. I'm slightly thrown by the microphone being attached to the camera. You might not want to sit there. If I move suddenly, the whole thing's going to come flying. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about Rodin and Degas, which has just opened in the picture gallery. And just so you know, that we're looking, I guess these are the lead works of the show. They sort of, if you haven't been up there, they're prominently on display as you go into the gallery, and they are on the left Rodin's Iris, Messenger of the Gods of 1891, and Degas' Little Dance at age 14 of 1882-81. And I guess they're two of the most significant sculptures of the 19th century, two of the kind of most groundbreaking sculptures of the early modern period. And so a real treat to have here. To give you an idea of the background of the exhibition, how we got here, I was thinking about an exhibition of Impressionist sculpture, because Impressionism is always good, isn't it, in a museum? And we were looking at a sort of number of sculptors who could be thought of. Impressionism is normally thought of as painting, and I'll come to that in a minute. But we're thinking about a number of sculptors who could be considered Impressionists. And I discovered that there was a show not that long ago, a few years ago in Germany, called Impressionist Sculpture. And there was about half a dozen sculptors in that. But as we looked at it and thinking about our spaces, and we were thinking actually at the time of the ballroom on the first floor, it seemed that it was too diverse a group of artists for such a small, compact space, knowing that we'd only have 24 or 15 sculptures in a space like that. And we boiled it down to Rodin and Degas, who the two leading figures of that period, of that movement in sculpture, but also I think most interesting because there is also this commonality around the themes of their work. So that's how we got there. I should say that it's not in the ballroom, if you haven't noticed. And to give you a small insight into the kind of practicalities of curating, when I removed the big table from the ballroom a couple of years ago, I had, and in thinking about it and arguing for it in advance of that, I had imagined things like Rodin sculptures in there with the daylight coming in and playing off their forms and the contrast of the sort of dynamic body against the symmetry of Great Pulteney Street behind. And then because we were trying to borrow work from the V&A asked the National Security Advisor to come down and inspect the ballroom, and he looked at it and said, "You're not going to take portable sculptures worth tens of millions of pounds and put them in a room with a balcony and single glazed windows." So suddenly I thought how brilliant they would be in dialogue with the pictures on the top floor. And there is something fascinating actually between the sculptures and the paintings. I think the contrast draws out the modernity of the sculptures, which is kind of what the show's all about. So just a bit of background on the artists. As I say, two of the major figures of the 19th century, both died in the same year in 1917, though Degas was slightly older. Auguste Rodin, known as one of the great, certainly the great sculptors of the 19th, early 20th century, actually one of the great sculptors, Western sculptors of all time. I mean, I think up there with Donatello, Michelangelo, Bernini, and so on. Rodin was born in 1840. He's such a seminal figure actually that when I worked at the Tate, where the sculpture, the international sculpture collection but is divided between the Tate and the V&A in terms of national museums, and 1840 is the dividing line. It's where the old stuff becomes modern, and it's because it's the birth date of Rodin. So that's the sort of status he has. He was a working class boy, son of a policeman in France, but became the major sculptor of his time, and is well known and was well known in his lifetime, and not least for the great monuments that were commissioned from him, like the Burghers of Calais, that was erected in Calais and then cast, put in various places, including Westminster, and of course this is his monument to Balzac in Paris, another public commission which was hugely controversial as well as hugely famous, and then of course the Kiss, which you may recognise, the marble version being in the Tate. There's a bronze full version the same size in Cardiff. In contrast, Degas is known of course as a painter primarily. He was very posh, unlike Rodin, and actually as he got older became very right-wing, which I'm slightly disturbed about. I didn't know that until recently. And in fact he only showed one sculpture in his lifetime, which was the Little Dancer. This sculpture, like all of his sculptures, was made originally in wax. This is much bigger than the other sculptures, as you'll see upstairs. And he showed it in the 6th Impressionist exhibition in I've got the date down here. Where did he show it? Come on. 1881, 6th Impressionist exhibition. He was, of course, part of one of the Impressionist group movement, but that was based on his painted work. And in fact, all of his other sculptures were cast in bronze after he died. So this work he showed in wax. It was initially shown as a nude, like that, and then clothed. And in fact, when it was first shown, it had a wig made of real hair, I think, which is pleasant. And then he cast it in bronze. And then, as I say, when he died in 1917, they found in his studio about 150 waxes of different sculptures, mostly human figures, dancers for the most part, but also a lot of horses. Horses were his other favourite subject. And of the 150, I think 72 were considered sort of complete enough to be cast in bronze. And so they were all cast around 1920-21. And then it got very confusing. One of the issues around both these artists is about when the bronze casts were made. Some of the Rodins were cast in his lifetime, but his work also continued to be cast after he died, and certainly the dealers are very snobby about whether they're lifetime or posthumous casts. And in fact, the Musée Rodin, part of its funding is still based on them casting new sculptures. So they're still issuing them now in a limited way. And similarly, the Degas, though they were supposed to have only been cast once in the 1920s, the same bronze foundry seemed to be producing them certainly in the 1950s, if not more recently. So that has been an issue. So as I say, we started this project thinking about Impressionism in sculpture. Impressionism, as you know, was the great revolution in painting when Monet, Degas, Renoir and others started exhibiting, and their work was thrown out of the Salon, the official kind of exhibition in Paris, and so they set up their own exhibition in competition with the Salon, and they took the name Impressionists from a critic's response to the first exhibition, which was commenting on this painting by Monet called Impression Sunrise. And I guess the key characteristics of Impressionist painting are their concern with light, which also then feeds into colour, of course. Their sort of very fractured kind of brushwork compared to the traditional painting or dominant painting of the time, and also their concern with modern subjects. This bit I think is often missed, but because they don't seem so modern to us perhaps, but you know, this Monet is very romantic. Obviously it's the sunset, or sunrise, I beg your pardon, clues in the title. That's a good thing I've got it here, isn't it? But you can see that he's also showing how, you know, sublime beauty can be found around a working dockyard. And as you'll remember, there are sort of famous Monets of, you know, the Gare du Nord in Paris, of the steam train arriving, Waterloo Bridge with the steam trains going across the Waterloo Bridge, which was a new bridge, and so on. So yes, they were, and a lot of paintings of the suburbs. So they were concerned with the painting of modern life. So in sculpture, what were the equivalents? And I think what you see in Impressionist sculpture, and you'll see in the works upstairs, is a similar concern with a kind of a sort of a fragmented or uneven surface, if you like. You know, where in the paintings you have these sort of broken brush strokes. In the sculptures, you'll see the surfaces are very kind of uneven and, you know, clearly worked. Even though we're looking at bronzes in every piece in this exhibition, you sort of get a feel of the clay or the wax in which they were originally modelled. They're very clearly modelled. And I think that sort of broken surface was, as in painting, a very deliberate sort of break away from traditional forms of sculpture, which were based on, you know, the perfection of the carved marble, really, that had continued from, you know, the classical period, the antique, through the Renaissance to the neoclassical of the 19th century. And in that sort of concern with a sort of broken modulated surface, you also see a comparable concern with light. I'm rather pleased with the way the sculptures have come up now. They've been, you know, since they were lit properly yesterday. And you'll see, actually maybe, why don't we change since we're talking about sculpture, not painting. You can see how important light is. Oh, it's starting to judder. How important light is, the way it plays off the sculpture, and it sort of helps you, you know, understand the form of it, if that makes sense. So the surface and the play of light are both, you know, completely integrated. And then in terms of subject matter, where obviously in painting the painting of modern life is reflected in the concern with, you know, industrial suburban places and the city and so on. In sculpture, it's concerned with a new idea of the body, I think, and you see a body that becomes, in contrast to the sort of traditional sculptural body of classicism, a body which is very expressive physically, also emotionally, and, you know, and quite clearly erotic in many instances. So here, this was Rodin's breakout sculpture, The Age of Bronze, that he made in 1875. It's best known in its full length version. There are casts of that, for example, at the National Museum of Wales. What we have upstairs is a sort of smaller version of the same image. It is believed to show a figure at the point of waking up. But it was also, when it was first shown, it was shown, I think, as under the title of The Vanquished. So it's showing someone clearly in an ambiguous state. The vanquished would be a figure who's been defeated and is exhausted. Whereas a figure waking up, this is a figure sort of just coming to life. And I think that's a really interesting idea, how you express that sort of liminal state of just coming out of sleep into wakefulness in something as solid as sculpture. And I think that, you know, Rodin's very interested in the sort of transient and how you inject a sense of the transience in a sort of, you know, what by definition is a solid static object. So he's interested in gravity, in flight and movement, and as I say, in that sort of, in this case, in this work, which started establishing his reputation in that sort of the point of awakening. Another work upstairs is Eve. This again is sort of, you know, it's about slightly under 1 meter high. There is a full height version as well. And this Rodin saw, isn't it? Obviously it's Eve, as in, you know, during the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. It's a little bit reminiscent of Masaccio's painting of Adam and Eve being thrown out from the Brancacci Chapel in Florence. And it's an expression of a figure feeling shame and guilt. So you see her hiding her face, and, you know, the pose of her arms around her body sort of gives you a sense of that sort of sense of shame and embarrassment and guilt. The Adam and Eve figures were originally conceived to flank the famous gates of hell, which probably is maybe one of Rodin's greatest achievements. I mean, to the extent that he did achieve it, it was a commission in 1880 for an entrance to a museum of decorative arts, I think. Why he decided to make it the gates of hell, I've no idea. It's a worry, isn't it, when you're in a place like this? And he worked on it continuously. He was still working on it when he died in 1917. He based it on one of the Dante's circles of hell in the Divine Comedy, which he sort of read voraciously. And within the gates of hell, you find some of Rodin's most famous sculptures. Let's see if we can find one and not pull the camera over. So the Thinker is here at the top. I don't know if has anyone seen this. There's a cast of this at the Musée Rodin in Paris. And it's very big. I mean, you know, taller than this room, I guess. So there's the Thinker. These, I can't remember what their title is. They're like the Three Graces, but they're not. And so on. So Adam and Eve were going to flank these as obviously the emblems of original sin that would flank the doors to hell. Just to show the contrast between why Rodin was seen as so radical, this is his Eve on the left, obviously, from 1881, and this is Thomas Brock's Eve from 1900. Brock is best known, oh God, is this right? I've suddenly had a moment of doubt. He's the artist of the Queen Victoria Monument outside Buckingham Palace that has been so prominent in recent weeks. But you can see how, you know, in Brock's work, who was, you know, the sort of leading sculptor in Britain of that time, still the sort of the sedate verticality and clean lines and smooth surfaces of the classical tradition live on, and how Rodin's figure with its sort of the light playing off the surface and the fact that that accentuates the surface as much as the form, but then also that sort of turning pose of the figure, which is sort of based on a kind of classical type. It's very Michelangelo-like, Michelangelesque, I was about to say, but it gives Eve a certain kind of sensuality, I think, which is sort of not really present to the same extent in Thomas Brock. And it's a reminder that sex and sexuality was quite prominent in Rodin's thinking, which brings us back to The Messenger of the Gods, which is more than I remembered, actually, when I saw it installed upstairs. Very uncompromising in its overt kind of eroticism. It's a naked female figure. The Messenger of the Gods, obviously Iris is a sort of flying figure. It was originally conceived actually for the gates of hell, but inverted, upside down. It's going to be a figure, winged figure flying down as the Messenger of the Gods. And then Rodin turned it the other way up, and it becomes more like a sort of dancing gymnast, acrobatic sort of figure, but with the emphasis very much on the figure's sex, which of course is emphasized by the fragmentary nature. The lack of a head and a left arm makes it all the more challengingly sexual, I think. I think it seems to be widely accepted that he had in mind Courbet's painting The Origin of the World, if anyone knows that, which is basically simply a painting of a woman from kind of there to there, if that makes sense, of her genitalia. So it's very much part of the modernity of this work is its uncompromisingly erotic sexual nature, I think. So that's, you know, and that's the most obvious contrast. I'm trying to remember why I put those two slides one after the other. That's the most obvious contrast between Rodin and Degas, where, you know, Degas, his fascination is with the ballet, and as I say, you know, most famously seen in The Little Dancer, which is a sort of, you know, exemplary in its sort of innocence in a way. One of the things that was in my mind in making the selection of the sculptures is that they're all about energy, I think. Now, some of them express that through their dynamism. through that, you know, like the messenger of the gods, you know, very clearly this is a figure flying through space who's just leapt off something or up into the air. But there is also sort of the imminent energy, the potential energy of imminent movement. So you see this sedate pose of the little dancer who feels like she's about to make a move. And similarly, the Age of Bronze, that sort of waking up figure, is about, you feel he's about to sort of launch into something more dynamic. Interestingly, one of the things that struck critics when they saw actually both these artists was the realism of the sculpture. So Degas obviously is seeking to achieve realism by dressing his little dancer in real clothes. She has a ribbon around her hair and a skirt around her waist. In this version, her bodice is actually part of the cast bronze. But Rodin's Age of Bronze was also, when it was first exhibited, people didn't believe that he had sculpted it. They saw it, and I mean, it seems hard to believe now, but at the time, compared to usual sculpture then, they thought it so realistic, they thought he must have cast it from life. And from then on, I understand, he tended to make all his sculptures either larger than life or smaller than life size to make the point that they weren't. I mean, and to back up this idea of Degas' realism and desire for realism, there are these drawings in the Louvre which were clearly drawn from life, and clearly the origin for the little dancer sculpture, though the sculpture is understood to have been modelled from life as well. The model is known, she's called, I'll tell you, Marie van Goerten. She was a young 14, 15-year-old ballet dancer at l'Opéra in Paris. Excuse me. And you can see here, you know, already the likeness of the face, if you compare that to the sculpture, is really striking. And already she's very sort of strikingly got this sort of upturned positioning of the head, and the cupping of her hands behind her back is very striking. I think this must be the drawing that the great Degas scholar Richard Kendall argued that all of these bronzes have got the skirts wrong, because in the drawing the skirt is below the knee, and these are too short. I don't know anything about ballet, so I'm not going to comment. So as I say, a majority of Degas' sculptures, all but that one found in his studio after he died in wax, are of ballet dancers, and a number of them are in, you know, well-known or recognised ballet positions. Is that what we call them? Thank you. So this is preparation for the dance right foot forward. That doesn't sound like a position. So let's move on to Le Grand Arabesque. So yes, so he as we saw from the painting, Degas spent a lot of time in the ballet school observing the ballet dancers rehearsing. He was also very fond of photography, so I don't know whether he used photography to help him towards these sculptures, because I'd like to think he didn't make people pose like that for long. But yes, so you see him working through a number of proper ballet poses, but he also made a number of sculptures where the pose is more informal, more incidental. So the dancer looking at the sole of her foot is one of my favourites. There's another one where she's sort of straightening her tights, which is very nice. And it's a reminder that part of Degas' modernity and innovation in painting was his ability to create a sense of, having captured in paint a sort of glancing moment. He was the artist who pioneered sort of odd compositions, so things were clearly influenced by photography. Things were cut off as if you were getting a real view of a thing, not sort of composed in the traditional sense. Or odd, he would make paintings in the theatre, but not of the drama on the stage, but of the audience to his right, say. And he famously talked about making images as if looking through the keyhole, which I think actually adds to part of the sort of erotic tone of some of his work. So here's a sculpture called of a woman getting out of the bath, so presumably she's cut off at the shin because she's still in the water. It's a very beautiful sculpture, it's a lovely movement, and when you go upstairs, do look at the sort of detail of the bronze, because it's remarkable how rough and unnaturalistic the surfaces are. I think it would be very easy sort of superficially to go into the picture gallery and think Rodin is very radical and you know, his surfaces are very broken, and Degas is much more sober and traditional, but you see the way he's worked some of the bronze, well, some of the wax, which is then captured in bronze, is remarkable. But this sculpture in particular reminds me of the, most famously, the sort of series of pastel pictures that Degas made of nude figures at La Toilette, as you call it in art history. And I think now, to a more contemporary eye, this idea of seeing nude women in the bath as if through the keyhole has a very clear kind of erotic tone to it. You know, the voyeuristic nature of that adds to the kind of the sort of sexual tension to it all. I was saying to Spencer outside actually that inadvertently we seem to have sex every season at the Holburne at the moment. I don't know. It's all those months of lockdown coming out or something, I don't know. So yes, so there is that again. I think, you know, I think, as I said at the beginning, I think one of the exciting things about seeing these sculptures in the picture gallery is that the sort of slightly unexpected contrast of these sculptures against the Gainsboroughs and the Ramseys and the Zoffanys is that it really emphasizes the radical modernity of the sculpture, and how that modernity is, you know, expressed through the human figure, and how the artist treats the figure, both in terms of the surfaces and the degree of distortion and so on, but also but also in their energy and their movement. You know, this sort of it's hard to imagine figures having that kind of dynamism in a sort of more traditional artistic traditions. So quite neatly for this conjunction of the two artists, Rodin later in life also became very interested in dance and dancers, in their kind of expressive movement, how their bodies could, the movement of their, you know, extraordinary bodies could express emotion and passion and so on. He made a series of these are kind of small like that if you haven't been upstairs, sculptures. We've got a group of 4 of them. There's a series of, well, they go at least up to G, as you can see, A, B, C, D, E, so there's at least 8 in the series, and they become, some are fairly believable, and some, like this one nearest me, I think is probably physically impossible. I think if you sort of straighten them all out, you'll find the limbs are ridiculously proportioned as well. But it, you know, exemplifies how he's using the human figure as a vehicle for expressing some, you know, some other ideas of energy and passion and emotion and so on. And then thinking of that, and rather neatly towards the end of his life, the sort of final work, if you like, in this selection is this little, this is tiny, it's sort of like this, and yet it's incredibly powerful when you see it upstairs. I hope you'll recognize that. This is a sculpture Rodin made specifically of Nijinsky, who in 1912 performed the Après-midi du Faune for the Ballet Russe. He had choreographed and designed it himself, and then danced it to the music of Debussy, and it was a created a huge uproar, where the critics saw it as outrageously sexual and erotic. He was accused of being sexual bestiality, I think, by the critics, there are photographs of it. There are some films on YouTube, but they're not from 1912, I suspect. But where you can see that the dance is about a faun waking up and then flirting with a whole series of wood nymphs, And then I didn't watch it all the way through because I read in a report that it ends with some form of simulated masturbation, or suggestion of, I should say. Anyway, Rodin was in the audience on the first night when so many people were outraged, but also the radicals, including Rodin, who by this time was 72, stood up and cheered in adulation of Nijinsky's, you know, kind of pioneering avant-gardism. Remember, the 1912, this just before the First World War, this is the great period of groundbreaking avant-garde activity, and Nijinsky epitomized that in dance. And so that Rodin then went to him and said, will you come to the studio and pose for me so I can make a sculpture, is really significant. It's a wonderful kind of coming together of you know, the ideas of both these sculptors, of the sort of expressive body, how the depiction of the human form can express those sort of big ideas of, you know, passion and eroticism as seen it through dance and movement, and, you know, this sort of capturing of a sort of, you know, kind of key high modernist moment. So though it's the tiniest thing in the show, it's a rather neat kind of final declaration, because it is the latest work in the show. And as you can see from the dating, it wasn't, weirdly, I don't know why actually, it wasn't cast in bronze at all until 1959, when there were supposed to be only 3 made, but there seems to be an awful lot more than 3 now. So there we are. So it's a show of 2 artists, 2 of the great figures of late 19th, early 20th century Western art. But it's really showing how through sculpture they kind of defined a sort of new form of sculpture for the modern age by focusing on the human body and by challenging the kind of traditions of the classical tradition that had dominated, you know, Western sculpture since the Renaissance. And still, you know, of course, the 18th century painters following Reynolds' lead were all looking to classical sculpture as they, you know, painted Mr. Byam gesturing like that. They were looking at classical sculpture. So there is, you know, a very sort of important kind of dialogue between these radically expressive, distorted, passionate figures and those apparently more sedate, clothed figures of the paintings around them. There's also, though, interestingly, I say that sort of from one point of view in the picture gallery. If you go upstairs and then you turn around and see these in relation to the Zoffany and the De Wilde theatrical portraits, there's quite an interesting synergy there, where those sort of, the crazy posing of Garrick doesn't seem quite so distant from the expressive sort of dance poses of the sculptures. Right, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Hello.
You mentioned the gates of hell. I was just wondering if you knew which layer down to the base of the house.
Fifth? I think it is the 5th, but I don't know for sure. No, not at all.
When you say that they were made in different sizes, how does that work? Who casts it? How did it? Did he make lots of different waxes in different sizes?
The Rodin, yes. Well, Rodin had assistants, so I think he would have. I do know. I don't actually know.
Because it's a question that came up.
Oh, okay. I'll try and find out. I mean, I know they're so precisely the same. I mean, they're not the same, obviously, but having spent some time today looking for images online to illustrate this, I can tell you it's quite hard to tell when you're looking at a full-size one or a tabletop version sometimes in photographs. So I suspect that they were made, well, in the Age of Bronze case, I'm pretty sure that was made as life-size, and then he would have scaled it down, and I suspect he or the assistants in the studio would have used some system of calipers or something to actually then make a object that it's sort of, to make sure it sort of accurately reflects the other version. It's certainly how Henry Moore would have done it. He would make a thing with his hands about that size, and then you'd scale it up 3 times probably.
Do you think Degas, because he only showed one sculpture, do you think that he did the other sculptures as a form of models for his paintings rather than?
I don't know.
Pieces.
I think
There were just dancers
and horses. Yeah, I don't think there is. I don't know of a direct relationship between the sculptures and the paintings. I think it's possible that he just did them and. Oh, sorry, I'm not going to take it. I don't think. I suspect he made them. I don't know if this is known, but I suspect he made them, because he wanted to make just out of a compulsion to make things, but then didn't see the need to.
There's a whole thing. If you make a model of something, it gives you more an idea of how to use it in a painting.
Yeah, I mean, it may be because they were 20, 30 years old when he died, and they were cast in bronze. So, yeah, it's not like he'd just been doing it and he didn't have a chance to cast them.
The other question I know that the public still asks is, do you know what the skirt's made out of for the little dance?
Well, it's a replica, so
But the skirt.
yes,
Material.
yeah, the skirt is the replica.
Oh, right.
It's not. It would be in the dark if it was the original. So I don't know. Even if I was going to say taffeta, but I don't actually know what taffeta is. You're asking the wrong person.
The Age of Bronze is so well known. Why was it renamed from the Vanquished?
I don't know. I don't know much, do I? It was only shown once. I think Rodin renamed it himself. He showed it once as the Vanquished, and then it was the Age of Bronze. I don't really know why it's called the Age of Bronze. I mean, if it's a figure waking up, it's not, unless it's a sort of explicit rejection of that sort of the tradition of the marble figure that was sort of the kind of stereotype of academic sculpture. Hello. All but one are under perspex, and then the rude one was roped off because it's too big to get a cover over it.
Where have they all come from?
They've come from well, the little dancers come from the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich. There are, because they're bronzes, there are multiple versions of each sculpture. So there are, I think officially, someone told me today who used to deal in these. There were supposed to be 12 or 5 little dancers, but he reckons he's counted 35 so far around the world. So the little dancers come from the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich. There's another in the Tate, for example. The Nijinskis come from the V&A, weirdly from their theatre collection, and then the rest are all from private collections. Just 2 or 3. A version of the Iris, Messenger of the Gods, used to be in Lucian Freud's bedroom, which probably shouldn't surprise us.
And Sylvester Stallone owned one as well.
Did he?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
He had a nickname for it, but I won't say
I'd just like to answer a question. A quick Google search has, I've done on a article about the Rodin Age of Bronze says that from his biography it was that he renamed it from the Vanquished to the Age of Bronze to distance it from its first initial criticism.
Oh, right. Oh, okay.
That's a quick Google search.
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't give you a more accurate
No, well,
answer.
the whole talk is based on quick Google searches. So, is there anything else?
What about photography?
Is it allowed, or did the artist use it? I could answer both of those. I think it's allowed. I can't. No, there's no reason. I haven't been told there's any reason not to.
There are 1 or 2.
Oh, really?
The four A, B, C, whatever ones, I think they've got no photography on them.
I wouldn't sweat about it though. I think they come from they come from a lender who doesn't really understand the significance of that. I think, but it's not like the Hockney because they're not. The artists are out of copyright, and there are multiple versions of each thing. So frankly, if you had a photograph of one, how would you know whose it was? I shouldn't be saying that, but also both artists were interested in photography. Degas famously took photographs and use them in his work. And Rodin was really fascinated by photography. And I think it's reflected actually. This is the period of the great sort of expansion of photography in the late 19th century, and I think that new ways of seeing the world and capturing the body in movement is really crucial to this. It's this sort of time, the late 19th century, that Muybridge was taking those photographs of the figure, doing time-lapse photography, so you see how figures, and in fact we know Degas looked at Muybridge because he was one of the first people to paint horses running with the legs in the right place. Yes?
Have we got any extra security or things we need to be aware of?
No. No, I mean there are undercover, so I hope we're all right. But now they're upstairs, we're fine. Now you can't run out onto the balcony with them. Anything else? No, I think we ought to go upstairs and have a look at them, shouldn't we? Thank you very much.